let's get into some useful React stuff. I've created a repo on the Third and Grove GitHub. You guys can follow along. I will put a link in the description. We're going to be going over a few different design patterns in React. So because React is just JavaScript, there's like 1,000,001 ways to do anything. And a lot of people hate this. I love it. Some people would call it an expressive way to do things, and I would agree with that. Now, that does mean we have to kind of come up with our own structure. And so that's why understanding some patterns that are useful in React is a good idea. And the primary concern in design patterns in React really is kind of readability for people who are coming into the project blind, or for just whatever number of devs are working in a project at once. Everyone needs to kind of understand what's going on, and also ease of reasoning about the way an application works. And so we're going to start with container components and presentational components. I think that's a good pattern to follow. It's something that I follow myself quite a bit in the React that I write, but it's also something that is less divisive than something like render props, which I don't necessarily like. I feel like it's ugly, but it's something that's good to know, and that pattern in particular would give you a good understanding of kind of how React works in certain areas. But we're just going to kind of touch on a few things here, and I'll show you some stuff. So let's look at this code. We're doing the normal importing React thing. We're importing some components here that are in this kind of project structure. They're in a component folder. I'm doing this thing with the index file that imports and exports default. This allows me to do a couple of different things, and this is outside of like the container component pattern. This is something that I do in most projects. You'll see it in Tag v5 right now. It allows me to work where, if I'm working on the title or if I'm working on the item list, that's what shows up in this tab. Whereas if you run through and you have, your index, you've got a bunch of index.js's up here. Who knows like what you're actually working on? Like I think it's a little bit better dev experience. It does kind of clutter this up a bit, but it does still allow me to keep everything in its own directory. So it's, granted, a trade-off, but it's something I feel really comfortable with, even though there's this like boilerplate of this import and export stuff right there. So there may be a better option. I haven't seen one just yet, but I am definitely open to changing that. But for right now, I think that's a good way to go just in project structure in general. Let's talk about use state. So React hooks went out live and are great. It's a very small surface area to work on. So it took me a little while to come around to using hooks, and a lot of that comes from building class components for a long time and using and getting really comfortable with the React lifecycle, and making very specific like optimization changes, using those life cycles, and not having that ability kind of freaks me out. Now, using hooks does not eliminate the need for class components. It does limit quite a bit in where you would use those. So they would really only be used in special cases where you need that super fine-grained control. The difference between a class component and a functional component used to be much bigger, and that's one of my gripes with hooks. So that's a whole other video on its own. I don't want to get sidetracked too much. So we have two different states here, which is one of the benefits of hooks. It's pretty cool. So we can have like our loading state and our item state, and we don't need to keep it all in one big state object that we have to kind of care for each key on its own and all of this kind of stuff. So that's pretty nice. So we have our loading and item state. We have a couple of methods here or a couple of functions here to add and remove items from our to-do app, and they're fairly straightforward. Then we have this use effect. Now, use effect is a hook that allows you to do asynchronous actions in a component. So this is something where we're going to be dealing with fetching data. So we have our fake fetch here that is going to give us a response, and then we're going to take the data from that response and update our items. So we can see that happening here. When I give that a refresh, okay, we're in a loading state, and then about a second and a half later, we've got a couple of items from the API or wherever we might get those. So this is just an example of, if I want to fetch data in React, how would I do that? Right now, the best way to do it is use effect. There's some forthcoming APIs that are going to make this a little bit easier and going to make handling like loading states easier. That's not coming till probably like Q4, so we probably wouldn't use that until like early 2020. This has been good enough in a lot of applications for a long time, and it's good enough now. I don't see us doing a whole lot of loading states, especially since primarily we'll be working in Gatsby, and a lot of that's statically rendered. We're not going to do a whole lot of this. Maybe we will, and that would be super cool if we did, because that's kind of one of the strong points of React is doing stuff like this and handling it in a way that's, I think, very, very readable and very understandable. So none of that so far is the container component pattern. So this component as the container contains all that logic, which is what makes it a container component. I wanted to introduce those kind of bits and pieces, but one really doesn't have much to do with the other. So we have all this logic, and essentially we're going to use it to pass on to presentational components. So one of those things might be this title component, which is doing something kind of stupid. It's just wrapping whatever the title is in an H1, and our title is like this static text. So let's make it something a little bit cooler than that. So it's going to give us the length of the array, which is a number. So we know we have like 2 things to do, and it's going to, update live, 3 things to do, that type of thing. So this isn't really something that you would use in this particular way, but you definitely would be doing logic and contain kind of state in one component and really pass that down to another component, so that you have this nice kind of composition here in what your component's returning. So you're rendering out something that, if I'm looking at this and I don't have the application open, I can still tell, okay, so this is something with some padding, and it's got a title, and it's got like clearly an input, and then it's going to list out some items, and those are contained in state here, right? So it's very easy to reason about what this is doing, what the point of these components are, and obviously you can move them around. They're also reusable in other areas of the application if you're able to kind of plumb the same data or functions to them. So we may have just a generic list component somewhere and extend that in some way to be an item list. So our item list is another fairly basic presentational component. It gets a little bit more involved here because we have a button. and that button needs to do something. So we've passed it our removal function, and essentially what we do is on click, we execute that, and we pass the item back. And so as a kind of callback, essentially we're running this, we destructure the ID out of this. Let me know if you guys want some more kind of detail on these arrow functions and destructuring and these kind of ES6 patterns. That's going to be really common throughout React, especially as we move more towards hooks. So if that's something that you find confusing or you want some more information on, I'm happy to kind of put something together on that. But really what we're doing here is just kind of passing data back and forth, but keeping the logic in one component so that it's not spread across, you know, all of these components. So our list does some very basic things. It renders the name and gives us this button. So all of that works. You know, if we go in here and we delete some things and, you know, we want to add another thing, it all works. And it's you know, not a particularly useful thing, but it's illustrative in this pattern of, you know, I want to pass data around, I want to asynchronously fetch some data, and I want to kind of keep my concerns, and my concerns here are logic and presentation, and I want to separate those to a degree, but I also want to maintain composability, which is like a core idea in React that's really important. Now, I've waited until this point to get into our input, because this is going to be a little bit different. So inputs are weird. Forms in React are a little bit weird. So I've started with a very basic form implementation, right? So you guys are familiar, form, regular HTML thing. We're, you know, giving it an on submit, and we're preventing default here so that we don't get that kind of page flash or refresh, because that for some reason is just the way that it wants to behave. And instead of doing that, we're using an add item callback, looking for this value on this particular input, right? So that's pretty straightforward, and you can totally do this in React. Clearly it works. You know, we can add things, we can do stuff. Like it works. But if I come into a React component and I see a form element, I kind of lose my mind, because there's a more elegant way to do this. Since we have the ability to use state and control state, I much prefer that. Now, this is an opinion, but I feel like it's important to have some sort of uniformity in this. And also, you may not be submitting a form, you may be doing something else with the data. So this is more in line with the way that I prefer to handle forms. And if we give that a save, we see that it behaves exactly the same way. I'm going to show us an additional benefit to using forms this way in React. This is what's called a controlled component, or a controlled input. And so we're telling it what its value is. And this on change is updating that value. We're doing the same thing with useState here. Instead of having a class component, we can do this with useState, with this hook. And essentially, we're only updating a string. When we spend more time on useState and hooks, we'll get into what exactly all of that means and how that works. But that's not the point of this video. Don't get me sidetracked. So we have this button, and it does an on-click, and we're pulling the value straight out of state. So this input is fully controlled by state, and this button doesn't know it's part of a form, it's just a button. I'm giving it an on-click, and we can pull any other data that we want and submit it with this form. This gives us a bit more control and a bit more options. And I'll show you what I mean by that now. So if we do a little bit more with this function, we can then, after we've added the item, we can then update the item with empty quotes, because I hate the way that this works where, I can add test a million times, right? Like, that's terrible user experience. Now, if I want to go and do this, look at that. It clears the form state out. Brilliant. Wonderful. Or we're going to have it say something like thanks, because maybe this is an email submission. Then you can submit thanks 1,000 times, but I think you get the point. This gives us a little bit more control within the context of React without having to reach into DOM APIs in particular. So I know I've gone over quite a bit here. Hopefully this was helpful. Oh, wait, one more thing. So I mentioned that this is a function component. We're doing some use state type things here. You may wonder, okay, well, what does it look like as a class? Well, here it is a class. So I think there's a bit more overhead here. We've got this, we're instantiating our state object. It has items, it has loading. So these are all kind of combined into one thing instead of separated out. So state is one thing here versus multiple things. We have our componented mount lifecycle hook, which runs when the component mounted. So this is where you would do data fetching. And here we're doing this.setState. When you're working in function components, you're not going to have a this context that's reliable to work with. You're not going to need to call this.setState. It's not going to be this.state.items. None of that. So removing this from React for a lot of people makes it much easier to come into. So that may be one advantage for using hooks and not taking this particular approach. But I wanted to show that these were functionally equivalent. So we'll do that now. So we've got this lifecycle hook, the exact same methods. Here they're methods, they're not functions, because we have this.addItem and this.removeItem, and they're calling and reaching into this to get state items, this type of thing, right? God, saying this so many times gets really confusing. I can understand why people maybe didn't like this. I don't mind it so much. It makes sense to me. So let's use this. So we're going to import app from app class. Now we're seeing the class component here. It behaves exactly the same way. So it's really just options, right? And so it's importing the exact same component over here in item input that we're for some reason doing this dumb like thanks thing for an input. Like, we don't want that. We want it to clear because we want to do this type of thing. So it all works. So the key concept here is container components will handle logic and behaviors, and your presentational components really are just concerned with presenting whatever props they're given. That doesn't mean they can't have some functionality. Anything complex or related to the state that becomes the props that are passed down, you really want to keep that in the parent component. You want to keep that in your container component. So you have one kind of central place that's handling things, and then you pass props and those are rendered in some specific way. Now, if this was all one component, this is a very simple, like trivial thing that we've built, but it would be something like 100 lines, and that's absurd. We want to keep our components relatively small and keep the code concise to what the point of the component is. So hopefully this was informative. Hopefully I covered everything that I wanted to. But we'll get into more kind of patterns, and in that same process we will basically learn more about React. And then once we've covered those, we'll get into some Gatsby stuff too. This all translates into Gatsby, so I feel like, you know, it's so many birds with so many stones. Anyway, let me know if there's other things that you'd like to know about that I haven't covered.